Hi, everyone. We're just waiting for the rest of our attendees to join. Um, for those of you who are already here, thank you so much. We have John with us, and wow, I'm seeing the numbers just jumping up. We're already at 150 people here. This is really exciting. So rough schedule. We have roughly an hour marked off for this event. We'll be starting off with John providing a presentation. He has some slides prepared talking about Drawdown, talking about the Drawdown 2020 review. And then for those of you who submitted questions, our team went ahead and selected a handful that we think would be most appropriate to ask John. Depending on how much time we have after John's presentation, we'll dive into those. Yeah, again, I just want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your Sunday to join us today. And John, thank you so much for being here with us. All right, folks. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started right now. I know that John is fully capable of providing his own intro, but what I'll say briefly is that I'm a huge fan, personally, of the work that Drawdown does. A lot of you found out about this event today because you're part of our mailing list at Climate.Careers. And just some brief background, what we do at Climate.Careers is heavily, perhaps entirely inspired by the work of Project Drawdown. So today we're thrilled to have Dr. John Foley join us, where he'll be talking about the work that Project Drawdown does, as well as providing an update for those of you who are perhaps familiar with their 2017 book, Drawdown, given that they have now released a new report on climate solutions titled the Drawdown 2020 Review. So without further ado, John, do you want to take it from here?
Sure, yeah. Hi, thanks everybody. And thanks, Evan, for the opportunity to speak to folks today. Really appreciate it. First of all, I hope you're all safe and sound and that everybody's weathering this kind of strange pandemic as well as possible. But I was asked to give a presentation about climate solutions to you all through Zoom here. And so let me go ahead and switch to some slides and we'll go ahead and do that. And then I hope switch to more of a conversation and some Q&A that Evan will be moderating. So let me just switch over to slide share. And we should be ready to go. And everything works. There we are. Is that looking right?
That looks great.
Okay, great. So today we're going to talk about the potential solutions to climate change and the work that we do at a place called Project Drawdown, which some of you might be familiar with, but maybe not familiar with our most recent work. So I hope this is a little bit of an introduction to climate solutions generally, but also an introduction to what Project Drawdown does, and especially our most recent work, which is very, very new and hopefully of interest to some of you. But when we talk about climate change, it's really useful, I think, to start by asking, how did we get in this mess in the first place? So many of our environmental issues today stem from this incredible transformation we've seen in the world in the last few decades. Simply put, our footprint has exploded in just the last few decades. Whether it's through a changing population or the fact we've suddenly become a highly urbanized species, or the fact that our economy has grown exponentially in the last few decades, even including the last few months. We've seen just an explosion of human presence and activity in just a few decades. For example, in the last 50 years, we've had a more than doubling of global population. But more importantly than that, the economy grew between 5- and 6-fold during the same time, adjusting for inflation. So we have twice as many people, but we're doing 5 to 6 times more stuff. That together has increased the demand for food about 3-fold, about a doubling of global water use, and an almost tripling of the use of fossil fuels in just a 50-year period. To put it another way, we've changed more in the last 50 years than not only any other period in history, but more than history itself. And no matter what we do, this kind of transformation of our economy and our need for resources has disrupted not only local environments, but now it's beginning to disrupt entire planetary systems, things that are really interconnected across the globe and vital to the whole planet's environmental systems, not just a single place. And some of these are obvious. Some of them we can see and touch with our fingers and eyes and everything. For example, tropical deforestation from here in the 1970s to this same scene, but only a few years later, showing the effect of globalization, kind of wiping out rainforests, replacing them with soybean plantations and beef pastures. In fact, globally, we've seen about 30% of the world's tropical forests have been lost in just the last few years, or last few decades, I should say. At the same time, our use and thirst for water has increased dramatically. So much so that even great inland seas, this is the Aral Sea in the 1970s, this is an incredible, huge body of water, major feature of Central Asia. But during the 70s and later, the Soviet Union started to dam up the water supplies that fed the Aral Sea regularly and used that water to irrigate the Kazakh desert to grow cotton. And so we've seen here even the loss of one of the world's largest inland seas, primarily for irrigation and human consumption. So we humans have changed the world in many visible ways, like the rise of our cities, the clearing of forests, the changing of water resources across the planet. But it's also changed the world in somewhat less visible ways, especially in our atmosphere and climate. Changing our climate, as you all know, is because we're adding more gases to the atmosphere than nature normally would have there, in particular, the so-called greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are inherently invisible to our eyes. They allow solar radiation, the stuff that our eyes are evolved to see in, it passes right through those gases as if they're invisible. But in the infrared radiation, where the Earth radiates into outer space, they're more opaque, and then they trap heat and re-radiate it down to the Earth's surface, making the surface of the planet warmer. We've actually known this for a very, very long time. In fact, starting in about the 1830s, we knew about the physics of a greenhouse effect. The first paper written on this that I'm aware of was written by a guy named Joseph Fourier, the French physicist, in the 1830s. But it was really starting around the 1850s, just as we started to increase the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, did we actually pin down the relationship between CO2 and climate change. It was actually an American woman named Eunice Foote who first published a paper on this in the 1850s. Unfortunately, I think because she was a woman scientist in the 19th century, she didn't get really much credit for it, and most of the credit went to a guy named Tyndall from the UK instead, but he published his paper 4 years later. So let's revise our history books and recognize Eunice Foote for the real discovery of how CO2 increasing like this can lead to significant temperature increases like this. What we've seen in the last century and a half is about a 50% increase in the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, along with other greenhouse gases I'll talk about in a second. And right alongside that, of course, is a warming of the planet. This is basically 19th century science. It is not worth debating it with people who just want to slow down progress. That's their trick, so I'm not going to. This is basic physics. We all know what's going on, and all the thermometers in all the world agree the planet is warming and we're causing it. So this is an incredible challenge, of course. We could go on and on about how important and dangerous this climate change phenomena could be. But I think it's really important to shift gears and actually move away from that kind of doom and gloom perspective and actually really proudly say the situation is not hopeless. There are things we can still do to avert the worst of climate change. 1 degree is already here and it's already having effects. It's already kind of too late to stop climate change to that degree. But it's not too late to stop it from getting a lot worse, which is what our obligation should be. So even though the world is getting kind of crazy and there's a lot of big environmental issues, we can change the world and make it better. In fact, some things have been getting better the whole time. Even though we've been seeing increasing pressure on the environment, we've been seeing some incredible improvements in human well-being in the last century. Far from perfect, but we have seen, for example, in the last 50 years, a massive increase in life expectancy. We've seen a massive shift in family size from the average woman having 5 children to now around 2.3. We're far more literate today, where about 86% of the world can read. 50 years ago, it was only 50%. Back in 1900, it was only 15%. So we're smarter, group of people now that live longer, healthier lives with smaller families with healthier children. We're also more urban, we're more mobile, we're far more connected, we're probably less violent than any people who've walked the earth. Still a lot of progress to make here, but we've made some. The point here is I think we can still build the future we want. We're not destined to destroy the planet through climate change and other things, but we're also not destined to have a beautiful world where everything works. But those are choices, and we have to make the choices about the future we want and then go out and execute on those choices. So a lot of this talk is about a possible future where we stop climate change, but it only happens if we make it so. My argument, though, is that we still can and that we should. Addressing climate change is certainly not the only thing we have to do to build a better future, but it's one of the most important, because climate change not only is an issue all by itself, but it touches so many other issues. It touches our food and water quality and supplies. It touches our, extreme weather events, things that happen to us. It also affects emerging diseases, but it also more or less affects our economy, security, and well-being in countless, countless ways. So if we don't fix climate change, it's going to be very, very hard to have a good and just and equitable future. So that's kind of what we're about. Project Drawdown is focusing on how do we solve the problem of climate change. We're an independent think tank. We're not part of a government. We're not part of a university. We're a standalone nonprofit. We are non-commercial. We are non-partisan. And basically, we're about half analyst and scientist and about half writers and communicators, roughly. And our job is to be a resource for you, for everybody in the world equally, to just, to really, really carefully look at climate solutions and ask the question, how big could these be? What might they cost? How could we deploy them? And so on. So that's what we're about. But we use this word drawdown to kind of talk about climate change. Sometimes people get confused and think drawdown means carbon removal or carbon sequestration or something. Like, no, actually, that's not the case at all. Drawdown actually refers to a moment in time, not a process. What we mean here is, here's the history of CO2 and other greenhouse gases building up in the atmosphere since the 18th century. So here we are, and if we do nothing, or if we keep on the current track, you might expect that CO2 levels will continue to rise, causing more and more climate change as those levels increase steadily. But we don't want to do that. What we want to do is bend the curve. Just like we do with pandemics, we've got to do with carbon. When we bend that curve, we can stop climate change, especially when we hit this point, that little blue dot. That is drawdown. It's a moment in time when the levels of greenhouse gases stop climbing. They stop climbing and they turn around and start heading back down again. The moment that happens is when we stop further climate change, and we can begin the very slow, long process of maybe even restoring our climate back to a more natural state. So that's our mission, is let's help the world get to that point in time where we stop the pollution and turn it around when we bend the curve, achieve drawdown, and let's do it as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. But first, how do we even get there? What do we need to truly solve climate change and achieve drawdown? Excuse me. I think it's really important to understand some of the basics of this problem. A lot of people think they know a lot about climate solutions, and they do, but there are some basic chemistry and physics things that we all need to know to just make sure we have a kind of a lucid conversation about these issues. So let's see if we can do that. The problem of climate change, as I've mentioned before, and you all know, is that some gases are increasing the atmosphere, the so-called greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is one of them, methane is another, a third is called nitrous oxide, and a fourth, where we don't have historical data on for very long, are what are called fluorinated gases. Let me show you what they do to the atmosphere. This is looking at each of those gases and also where they come from and how much effect they have on warming. Instead of looking at these gases in terms of the volume they have in the atmosphere or their mass or the number of moles or whatever a chemist might look at, instead what we did is we actually translated this into the heating effect of each chemical, because some of them trap heat better than others, some of them live longer than others. Here we're looking at what's called a 100-year global warming potential. It means how much heating impact would that have over the next 100 years. So here we can look at CO2 coming from burning fossil fuels. A lot of people believe that's the only thing that starts climate change. If you ask most folks what causes climate change, they'll say burning fossil fuels and CO2. And yeah, you'd be about 62% accurate. That's still a passing grade in most classes, but it's basically a D minus because you forgot about 40% of the problem. It turns out CO2 comes from a lot of chemical processes too, without even burning any fossil fuels, including the manufacture of cement. That's a huge area. It turns out that CO2 is also released from deforestation, especially burning down rainforest and things like this, but other forms of land clearing around the world. Whenever you burn anything made out of carbon, whether it's coal or a tree, they both form carbon dioxide. We also have methane, which is another powerful greenhouse gas, partly from industry, because methane is also, we know, is natural gas. When we drill for it, especially in fracking facilities and in our natural gas pipelines all the way to our homes, there's sometimes leaks in the drills, in the kind of wells, in the fracking infrastructure, and in the pipelines. And those can leak methane into the atmosphere, contributing to more climate change. But actually, most of it comes from agriculture. That we humans have contributed significant amounts of additional methane by growing so many animals, primarily ruminants like cattle, sheep, and lambs. And it doesn't matter, despite a lot of widespread myth, it doesn't matter if those animals are on a feedlot or on grass, they both burp methane, no matter what. The grass-fed beef, though, has the advantage of maybe offsetting those methane emissions by building up the soil beneath them, offsetting some of those emissions. But until we do that, methane sources from agriculture are huge, mostly cattle, a little bit with rice fields. Agriculture also emits a huge amount of greenhouse gases called nitrous oxide. This is when we use too much fertilizer and too much manures on a farm field. Sometimes the nitrogen in those fertilizers and in the manure combine with water and air and form nitrous oxide under certain conditions, which gets into the atmosphere and causes even more climate change. And then we have these funny little things called fluorinated gases, or F gases. These are industrial chemicals, mostly used as refrigerants, but in other things too. Right now, that's about 2% of our recent warming, but that number is poised to grow significantly, maybe doubling or tripling, as more and more people around the world buy air conditioners and refrigerators for the first time. About 2 billion people are now rich enough to do that. But they live mostly in countries where the regulation and the disposal of those chemicals is very, very lax. So many of them could leak into the atmosphere and cause more climate change. So this is kind of the chemistry view of the problem. We have stuff from energy, we have stuff from agriculture, and we have stuff from materials, and we've got about 4 big gases we've got to tackle. That might be interesting, but it's maybe more interesting to skip from the chemistry to kind of the economic view of how this works. Here's the atmosphere. Imagine the atmosphere is a big box in the sky that we can add stuff to, but we can remove stuff from. Maybe like a bathtub where you fill it up with a faucet, but you empty it with a drain. It's a kind of a dynamic system with sources and sinks. On the source side, the things that add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, here are 6 things that we do as humans, now labeled not as gases, but as economic activities, showing how we cause climate change. We'll go into this in more detail in a little bit, but you see first is like electricity is pretty big, food, agriculture, and all associated land use is quite large, industry is big, transportation, the emissions directly from buildings. Buildings also indirectly emit from electricity and transport and other areas. And then we have another category of just everything else or other. Well, those are the sources of greenhouse gas pollution, and we'll go through them one by one, showing how we can reduce them. But the atmosphere doesn't sit still. We might put in like 100 units of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere each year, let's say, but about 40 of them are instantly, practically, usually within a few months, removed from the atmosphere, mainly by forest and by oceans. This is entirely, so far, the job of nature. Humans talk a lot about carbon sinks and how we might be able to create them, but we haven't yet, at least none that have been measurable from the atmosphere's point of view. They're so small, they're like a round-off error. Hopefully we can grow bigger ones, but at the moment the job is primarily done by nature, not us. So if we put in about 100 units worth of stuff in the atmosphere and we remove about 41 of them, that leaves behind each year 59% of each of our year's emissions. That will then build up year over year over year, causing those levels to rise. Just like your bathtub will rise if the faucet's putting more water in than the drain can take out. So that's the atmosphere. And this diagram right here is probably the single most important diagram people should know if they're even ever going to think about climate solutions. You have to know where the pollution comes from and then where it goes and how it builds up. So to achieve drawdown, to stop climate change, we've got to look at both sides of this equation. Neither one is sufficient. We have to look at both sides in every single sector. So to achieve drawdown, this is the current picture. We've got more crap going in the air than nature can remove, so the greenhouse gases continue to rise. That's the current situation. But if we wanted to stop this, first and foremost, there's no way around it, we must bring the sources to zero. Again, if your bathtub's overflowing, you got to turn off the faucet before you kind of play with the drain to see if the water can go out faster. So let's turn off the bloody faucet of this pollution and bring these sources towards zero. This can't happen overnight. It's going to take years and maybe decades to really make progress on this, but we can, and I'll show you how in a few minutes from Drawdown's point of view. We also, though, have to pay attention to the other side of this equation and make sure that nature remains healthy so that it can continue to be some kind of carbon sink, removing excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into forests and oceans. Maybe we can even add to those sinks ourselves in agriculture or machines or other things. But what we here now will have is if we bring the sources to zero and we continue to have carbon sinks of some kind, then we peak greenhouse gases, hit drawdown, and then bring them down steadily after that. That's how we stop climate change. Stop the pollution and help nature. Those are the two biggest levers we have. I'll talk about a third lever we have later, but let's start with those two. So the solutions to climate change that Drawdown evaluates are in those kind of areas. How do we reduce pollution from the beginning? How do we maintain nature's ability to absorb excess gases? And these are the solutions we evaluate. I'm going to just be very upfront here too. And Drawdown only evaluates solutions that actually exist in the real market. They have to be a certain scale. There have to be enough studies of them for us to, independently and solidly evaluate them. What our researchers do is they go back and look at every single paper written about any possible climate technology or solution, and we do what's called a meta-analysis. We can statistically analyze all of the possible answers to how big a solution might be, how much it costs, and so on. And we try to find the statistical consensus of that and put it into models that allow us to look at them all in tandem, not just in isolation. So when I show you the solutions to climate change, some of you might be like, yeah, but what about my technology that I'm working on? Great, when it's out in the world and it's big enough to have numbers on it, not by you, but by independent scientists and engineers and policy people, then we can truly evaluate it. Otherwise, it's still kind of in the lab. So the solutions I'm going to present are mainly focusing on reducing sources. That's principle one. How do we cut the emissions to zero? Later, we'll be protecting nature and maintaining sinks. But if we're going to start reducing the sources of greenhouse gas pollution, again, let's walk through them. What are they? They're mainly in electricity, about 25% there. Food, agriculture, and land use is almost a tie for that as the two largest sectors contributing to climate change. Strangely, electricity gets far more attention than the food system does, but they're equally important as sources of greenhouse gases. All industrial emissions show up here about 21%. Transportation is about 14. Buildings and I have to be careful here, this means the on-site combustion of fuels on buildings like natural gas, heating oil, and so on. These are the emissions coming out of a physical building. Some people think buildings are much larger, but they're counting the electricity drawn into a building, but actually the emissions of electricity are counted at the power plant. So we have to be a little bit careful, but buildings can affect a lot of other sectors, but directly on-site building emissions are about 6%. And everything else is the remaining 10. I think it's pretty handy for everybody to kind of remember that the 5 biggest sources globally of greenhouse gas pollution are just 5 things equal 90% of the emissions. There's electricity, food, industry, transportation, and buildings. So those are the 5 big areas we can focus to reduce climate change. By the way, this donut chart is for the globe. For other parts of the world, it looks very, very different if you look at one state or one city or one country at a time, because they've made different kind of areas of progress here. In California, for example, electricity is like 15%, but transportation is closer to 45%. So California's biggest challenge is really around cars and trucks, not electrical grids. But anyway, let's walk through all of the different kinds of solutions we can maybe do to address climate change from the source. So in electricity, again, 25% of the emissions come from how we produce electricity. Most of it's burning coal or natural gas. If we produce electricity with renewables or non-carbon emitting solutions, that can go away. The other side of the coin, though, is we can look at how electricity is used, the kind of demand side, and say, wow, a lot of electricity is used in buildings, a lot's used in industry. Maybe we can make buildings and industry more efficient and use less electricity no matter how it's produced. So with all of our solutions, there tend to be a group of them that are focusing on efficiency. In this case, the efficiency of electricity needs. A lot of this is in buildings or some industries and things like this. So you'll see a lot of solutions here. They're familiar energy efficiency solutions. We really need to finish up and get all of those done. But then we can also find a family of solutions, not just from efficiency, but in kind of transforming the electrical system. How do we produce it? Let's stop burning coal and gas and start using more solar, wind, water power, geothermal, biomass, maybe nuclear, energy capture, so on and so forth. And then there are some solutions we need that don't reduce emissions, but they enable a larger system that does. So things like building more flexible and dynamic grids, improving energy storage, and so on. When we look at all of the solutions to climate change, in the first version of Drawdown, we simply ranked them, but I think it's far more interesting to show them actually clustered together. So here we see individual solutions to climate change as a circle. The bigger the circle means the bigger the solution could be. In fact, we're showing a range of answers for a lot of them. The darker and brighter circles represent the range of this possible solution in the future, depending how we implement it. The size of the circle means how big the solution is, but then we've clustered them into saying, hey, a whole bunch of them work together around energy efficiency, and a whole bunch work together around transforming electrical production to low carbon sources. So that's kind of how we're looking at Drawdown in 2.0 as kind of in the family of solutions as well as the ranked size. In food and agriculture, we can see some interesting things too. For example, most of the emissions come from 3 big areas, especially deforestation. That's kind of the #1 area of emissions, clearing forest and other land use. Second would be basically meat and dairy products, methane production from too many animals, and a little bit from rice fields. Grass-fed can be better, but only if you build up the soils. But animals on grass still release methane. Actually, they release more methane per pound of meat than feedlots. So we have to worry about both of those things. But grass-fed has the advantage of sequestering carbon where feedlots can't. The third area is around fertilizers and manure, the nitrous oxide emissions we see from that. And then everything else in the food system's remaining 5% or so. This is really, really important. The food sector, we've primarily going to tackle things like deforestation, methane from animals and rice, and overusing fertilizers. Everything else is kind of more of a round-off error. To do this, again, we can think about efficiency. Just like electricity, we're wasting electricity in our homes and buildings We similarly waste enormous amounts of food. One is purely food waste. About a third of all the food in the world is never eaten at all, not just in America, but in the world. And because of that, it means a third of the emissions of greenhouse gases, a third of the forest cleared, a third of the water used, and a third of the pollution caused, and so on, wasn't necessary. So the single biggest lever in fixing the food system in every possible calculation is reducing food waste. That is a huge win for the environment and food security and so on, and yet we're doing relatively little about it. The second biggest area is eating a little lower in the food chain, more plant-rich diets. Sure, some people will continue to eat meat. Some people really need to in developing countries where that may be the only secure food supply. But in wealthy countries, we could certainly dial back the amount of meat we eat a little, especially red meat, into other forms of protein that are less resource intensive. That could be very helpful. We also have to protect ecosystems actively, not just kind of hoping they don't get cleared, but let's protect them so they don't. So protecting forest and also peatlands, especially in places like Indonesia, where you tear down a rainforest and burn it down, but there's also peat underneath, which is also huge amounts of carbon that get released. And then finally, improving agriculture itself. We hear a lot about ideas of like regenerative agriculture. Here, we're going to show a lot of those solutions on how they reduce the emissions from agriculture. Later, we'll show how regenerative agriculture can also add a carbon sink to agricultural landscapes. But on reducing the emissions, what goes into the air from agriculture, it's going to be food waste, plant-rich diets, protecting forest and peatlands, and then farming differently, especially how we manage nutrients. Those are going to be some of the big wins. Industry has a whole bunch of different things in it. It's kind of a complicated sector because it includes things like metals, making steel, it has cement, it has chemicals, all the world's plastics are in here. Plastics are about 1% of climate change right now, but they could grow. Managing all the world's waste is another sector of about 3%. We have not evaluated all the possible kinds of industrial solutions just yet because so many of them are just still getting into the world. But of the ones we've looked at so far, managing refrigerants, those fluorinated gases, turns out to be really important, as is cement, a little bit in plastics, and a lot about how we manage waste better. Then we can go to transportation. We're all familiar with this. Transportation is about 14% globally of our emissions, though in California, I mentioned, it's more like 45%. So it really depends on where you are. But in the world as a whole, most of those emissions come from road transport, that is cars and trucks. Flying, even though it gets a lot of attention, is still about 1.8% of greenhouse gas emissions. And yes, they do make contrails that have a local warming effect for a couple of hours on a clear day, but mostly they don't. And so do other things, by the way. Other things have local warming effects as well that we don't take into account. So flying really is a little under 2%. But it nevertheless is very, very important because every percent matters. We're going to need to tackle all those little wedges. But let's just not lose sight of the fact road transportation is the elephant in the room when it comes to transportation right now. So we can look at solutions here about making the current systems like cars and trucks and planes more efficient, even if they still burn fossil fuels. So replacing an SUV with a hybrid, for example. We can use less of our fossil fuel infrastructure by doing things like public transit, carpooling, virtual conversations and telepresence and so on. So that's shifting to alternatives. And then the vehicles we still need, let's make sure they're electric, like cars, but also trains. People kind of forget that Americans' train system outside of Boston to Washington is incredibly dirty and uses very old diesel locomotives that are very, very polluting and not clean at all. And in fact, if you take Amtrak to go from one city to the other in the US outside the Northeast corridor, you're emitting a lot more carbon than if you had flown. So we need to really clean up our trains in this country. Europe is no problem, Japan isn't a problem, but here it still is. So a lot of opportunities in transport to reduce emissions. Buildings, I mentioned, again, we're only counting the emissions directly from the building itself. Obviously, buildings consume electricity. They're the destination of transportation. So depending on how you like to do your math, you can make it look bigger or smaller. But the proper accounting, the official UN accounting does it this way. And it shows the direct building emissions are primarily residential buildings, homes, 2 to 1 to commercial and public buildings. So we got a lot of work to do to kind of retrofit homes and buildings across the world. Again and again, we see efficiency is really, really important. And then how we use and replace carbon-based fuels with something else is really important here too. So those are the ways we can reduce the kind of sources of greenhouse gas pollution, the original pollution that causes the problem in the first place. But then we can work on the other side of the equation, but only secondarily. If you only rely on carbon sinks and you don't address the sources, you're just on a big treadmill. You have to reduce the sources to zero, otherwise you're just postponing the inevitable. But we also can use sinks to buy time and kind of bend the curve back down a little faster. So sinks of carbon primarily right now are in land, and they're primarily in nature, mainly the world's forest. To continue for that to happen, because forests are being cleared, they're burning down, they're in a hotter and drier climate in many cases, not only do we have to maintain what is there now, we might look for ways to augment it by adding additional carbon sinks. So here are ways we've looked at to do that. I'm not going to go into great detail, but the middle circle shows how protecting and restoring ecosystems themselves is crucial. On the right, we say, let's look at the lands that have been degraded already by human activities and maybe bring them back into production, especially with forest and high biomass, things like bamboo. And then to the left, this is kind of the regenerative agriculture kind of space, where a whole plethora of practices in cropping and grazing and agroforestry. Turns out the agroforestry part of this is probably the most important when we look at all the numbers, whether it's silvopasture, tree intercropping, and so on. Putting trees into our working landscapes is a really good idea. We find that we can also add new carbon sinks, both in trees and in soils. Again, I want to stress, be careful here. There are a lot of very, very loud and big claims about how regenerative agriculture might save the world. Most of those claims are being made by people trying to sell you them. Be careful there. The numbers we look at do support this idea, but at a much lower size than is being claimed by a few. So just be a little bit careful there. We love this solution, but we're a little bit cautious about how large it could be and how long it can last. Then we have other kind of climate change solutions in the oceans. These are just beginning to be explored, but marine permaculture, kelp farming, things like that are pretty exciting. I'm actually excited about things that are pretty simple, like maybe restoring and protecting wetlands, especially mangroves, which sequester huge amounts of carbon, but also keep beautiful habitats intact, and they protect our coastlines from storms. So that's kind of a triple win. But there'll be many, many more ocean solutions down the road. Finally, there are engineering technologies that can kind of mimic what nature does and sequester carbon from the atmosphere, either to store it or better yet, to use it for something. So we can pull carbon out of the air and stick it in rocks or in biochar and other things, and that's all lovely and good idea. Down the road, though, we might be able to, and we can at a lab scale right now, pull carbon out of the atmosphere and turn it into jet fuel or into plastics or things we might still want to use. But instead of using oil to make that stuff, we're using the pollution from the sky and removing it, turning it into a useful product for us. So there are a lot of ideas like this out there, but none of them are yet at a large enough scale to truly address kind of the economics of this. Well, we're keeping a very close eye on it. So we've reduced pollution and we've helped nature maintain sinks. The last area Drawdown looks at as well doesn't show up on those bigger charts. It's about improving the fundamental bedrock of society. Now, these are things we should do because they're right, not because they're climate solutions. They're just human, good things to do. They're part of making a better world, no matter what the climate does. Especially when you think about education and healthcare. Education and healthcare opportunities are woefully inequitable around the world. Many people do not have good access to education and primary healthcare, especially in developing countries. Mostly women and girls have a huge gap in that opportunity compared to their male counterparts, but it's very inequitable overall. But if we can focus on improving healthcare and educational opportunities, especially for women and girls, we see some kind of benefit back to climate change down the road. Right now, most of the emissions causing climate change come from the big rich countries of the world, like US and China and others. But down the road, developing countries, which are still growing their population a lot, will also get richer and emit carbon if we don't do a lot. So reducing the curve of population growth down the road kind of pays off as a climate solution as well. And the only way to reduce population growth without being coercive and violating human rights is to do the opposite, is to improve human rights. So when girls and women get more access to opportunity, they tend to have healthier children, fewer children, and maybe a little bit later in life because they have other opportunities to do multiple things now. So this is a good thing for the world generally, and it has a little bit of a feedback on climate change that can help long term. Now we can put all this together. I showed you kind of a clusters of solutions and how we can reach drawdown. In the original drawdown, we kind of ranked the solutions one by one. We jumped from, hey, we can solve climate change to here's a list of 100 things. We've redone those lists. The rankings are all updated now. We also show multiple rankings of different scenarios because each one could be a little bit different. Those exact rankings are actually pretty fluid depending on how you want to achieve climate change. Here's a ranking for one of our scenarios from the first 20 solutions. But personally, I don't like the rankings because we have to do all 100 solutions anyway. Who cares if one is 15 versus 17? We've got to do every one we can anyhow. What's more interesting is which solutions can we do now, and then which ones might take more time, and which ones might have some synergies doing them together. So instead of that approach, I tend to like to look at solution bundles rather than individual ranked solutions. So we have a whole bunch of solutions that reduce pollution. I've showed you a bunch in electricity, in food, in industry, in transportation and buildings. That's kind of the taxonomy of the solutions. Those circles represent bundles of solutions within which there might be a dozen individual things. But altogether, the size of that circle represents the sum of all of those solutions, like energy efficiency and renewables and electricity, or food waste versus protecting ecosystems. So this is probably a much higher level way to kind of see climate solutions. We can also look at the sinks of greenhouse gases. The ones we have looked at, the ones that are more advanced and have more data, are on land. We're beginning to look at a few in the oceans, and we're beginning to look at a few that are engineering and kind of machine-based. Those engineering and coastal solutions, nevertheless, I think will grow a lot as we learn more about potential solutions here and get more data on how they really work. And finally, this improving society, we put a little bit over to the side because it should happen anyway, irrespective of climate change. But we have actually analyzed the potential kind of secondary effect of doing the right thing for people. Secondarily, does some good for climate as well by bending a few curves of future emissions and population. So we see this whole picture here. If every circle here represents many dozens of things, but we put them all together, we have enough to reach drawdown and stop climate change. So we took all these new solutions. By the way, we've updated all of them since the book. The book now is basically out of date. So please go to our website at drawdown.org and download for free, by the way, and the new book, which is simply called the Drawdown Review 2020. And we're going to be publishing that every year to keep up with the changing landscape of technology and economics. But we took all those solutions and ran them through an atmospheric model of the physics and chemistry of the atmosphere and asked, so what would it do if we implemented these drawdown solutions? Well, the red curve is kind of the business as usual scenario of like, if we continue on the best guess path of the future. The yellow curve and the green curve are two different scenarios we built using drawdown solutions to see what would happen. These are only two scenarios. We could have made 1,000 of them, but we just wanted to illustrate them with two. And these two were picked so that they basically could stop climate change in the 2040s. That's the earliest we could probably stop climate change based on our assessment of these climate solutions, but maybe as late as the 2050s to 2060s. So these are kind of the bookends of climate solutions, depending on the degree of ambition we want to use to deploy them. Incidentally, those two scenarios land either at 2 degrees warmer than normal, the original Paris commitment, or 1.5, which is the amended Paris commitment to climate change. Climate scientists have been saying, you know, once we get above 1.5 to 2 degrees, we're starting to get into a pretty dangerous world that needs a lot of care. So it turns out that, yes, drawdown with existing technologies can do what we need to do. And that's really exciting. Naturally, we'll be adding additional technologies. Some of you online are probably working on a lot of these. That's really, really cool. Thank you. Let's bring them on board. Our point is, though, that we can start today with what we have. And what we need more than new tech is more time. What we have lost is about 30 years of inaction, thanks to oil companies and the politicians they've bought and so on. We've wasted 30 years. If we'd started 30 years ago, we'd be already very far along and it'd be a much easier job. But now we have kind of an emergency and we've got to really hit the brakes on the planet. And we have nothing but the technologies in hand to deploy now. Let's do it now. But a lot of people say, oh, this will be too expensive. We can't do that. Oh my gosh, you know, what will it cost? Well, it turns out, yeah, fixing the world costs some money. And so we're being honest about that. This is what's called a cost curve. It shows in the horizontal how big the climate solutions are. And these are all stacked up together, showing about 500 gigatons of solutions in this one diagram. The vertical axis shows the cost of the solutions. Now, yes, initially in this scenario, we'd have to spend about $25 trillion over the next 30 years or so to get the, to deploy the technologies in the first place. But here's the trick: when you actually run them for 30 years and save a huge amount of money and create new revenues, we in fact can make between 90 and maybe $140 trillion by doing this. That's like a 5, 6, 7 times return on investment, depending on how you look at it. So we have an enormous opportunity for economic benefits here. It doesn't cost too much. In fact, it'd be stupid not to do it. And this, of course, doesn't even take into account the cost of additional climate change to the planet in terms of damages it would cause. So solving climate change is probably the biggest business opportunity in all of human history. Conservatively, it has a massive return on investment, could create hundreds of millions of new jobs, and oh yeah, saves the world. So we've learned a few lessons along here, and I'll wrap up in a minute and hope we can take some questions. But the big lessons we've learned here is that it is absolutely not too late to address climate change. With tools we have right now, if we just scale them, we can stop climate change between the 2040s, 50s, and 60s, depending how aggressively we move. Of course, new solutions are needed, but what we need most of all is time, not tech. So now is always better than new. Again, those of you working on new technologies, thank you. We'll need them, but we can't wait for you. So we have to start with what we have in hand now and deploy them into the future. To deploy these climate solutions, though, we're going to need some help. The solutions themselves just don't happen by magic. We need what we call accelerators, the things that move solutions from paper to practice. And we need a whole bunch of them. There's no one of these that could possibly do it all. Of course, the people interested in politics like to talk about policy. People in technologies talk about tech. Business people talk about capital and business, of course. But you know what? We need it all. We're going to have to change the rules, change the policies. We've got to move trillions of dollars of capital out of oil and bad agriculture into better systems. We need businesses to be rewarded for doing the right thing and penalized for doing the wrong thing in a better way. Yes, we need some new technologies, and I'll show you the ones we need, but we also need to focus tech on the practical, not just the fun. And finally, yes, behavior change, our individual actions do have to be part of this, because at the end of the day, a lot of the emissions happen in my car and my apartment and your apartment and your car. So our behavior does play a role in this, but it's not the only part of this, and we shouldn't feel guilty because the larger system makes it hard for us to do the right thing. But together, these kind of 5 accelerators can actually rapidly deploy solutions if we use them in tandem, and we recognize that it's not just one at a time. But if we're going to think about solutions over the next 50 years for climate change, I like to think about it as, again, this is a 30-year journey. One election isn't going to stop this or start this. This is 3 decades of work. We're going to have to move trillions of dollars, change the way billions of people do things, and we're going to have every government in the world and every business in the world and every community in the world thinking about it. This is a big job, folks. But I think there are maybe 3 waves of action that all start today, but that move forward in different ways, kind of over time in a different kind of crescendo as we move over the next 3 decades. For example, the first thing we should do, I think, is deploy the really cost-effective solutions that already exist, have existed for decades, in fact, but we haven't done enough of them. Energy efficiency would be number 1. Everything we can do there, Americans in particular are woefully inefficient with the use of energy, whether it's electricity or heating or fuel efficiency in vehicles. We could cut a lot of our emissions in half right away today and save money by buying smaller cars, retrofitting our buildings a little bit, and changing our appliances when it comes time to do so. Easy, 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 but we need to do far more of that. We also need to tackle food waste, the other big inefficiency on the planet. Huge opportunities there, and those can begin today. We need some policies that can stop us from doing bad things like leaking methane from natural gas pipelines and not requiring them to be plugged. I think we need policy to make sure every natural gas facility doesn't leak any methane at all, period. Let's fix the leaks. Similarly, around deforestation, let's stop deforestation. Let's bring international pressure to bear on Brazil, on Indonesia, on the hotspots of deforestation, and make it a thing of the past. These are things that are maybe the focus of this coming decade because I think we can get them done. We also can start deploying renewables. 5 years ago, I might not have said this, but renewables now are beating fossil fuels in the marketplace. This is the 2019 cost of electricity in America. Solar and wind, even building entirely new solar and wind facilities, is still cheaper than burning old coal power plants, running old nuclear power plants, and a lot, not all, a lot of our gas facilities. So solar and wind are definitely favorable in the markets. And in the future, what we're seeing is coal and nuclear being retired, and wind, solar, and a little bit of gas, but much more advanced gas than we've had before, are coming in to replace it. That's pretty interesting and very exciting. But along with that kind of early wins, kind of 2020 focus, let's crash on this stuff to get as much emissions cut as we can right away. The second wave is going to have to take a while. It starts today, but it's about the retrofitting of infrastructure. It's about every building in the world, every car in the world, every farm in the world will have to change. Every furnace, every hot water heater, every internal combustion engine, every tractor, every fertilizer user, every cow, every pasture, everything in the world will have to flip. And no matter how you do the math on this, I don't know how you can't do that, but over a few decades. Let's start now, but it's talking about many, many, many years of effort going into the 2030s and beyond. But the best time to get started was 30 years ago. The second best time would be today. The third kind of wave of action, I think, also begins today, and it's really kind of new technologies. But the technologies we actually need are very rarely the ones I hear about in Silicon Valley. But what we really need, because we don't have alternatives for this that are commercially viable yet, are things like alternative cements, new ways of making steel, new ways of making plastics, and so on that are carbon negative, or at least carbon neutral. So I think we're going to need a lot of new technologies to kind of replace things that otherwise we humans are going to have a hard time giving up. So that's going to be pretty interesting, and we'll see how that plays out in the coming decades. And plus, other technologies may or may not arrive. I've been hearing about fusion since the I haven't, I wasn't born yet, but we've been talking about fusion since the 1950s, and it's always 20 years away, no matter when you ask. Or modular nuclear reactors, I've been hearing about those for 20 years, and they're yet to be one. So I'm not going to bet on some technologies, but some we already have. We just have to make them affordable. Let's get to work. So we have solutions, and instead of thinking about this as just some giant pain in the ass problem to solve, I think about it as an incredible opportunity because we get to reimagine the world. It's the biggest opportunity to fix the food system, the energy system, to grow our economy, to grow equity and more justice if we do it well. and make a far, far better world. All of that is in our power. We just have to seize it. The other thing we need, though, besides all these technologies and practices and accelerators, is maybe a different form of leadership. Too much of the leadership we have today is about creating a vision of a nightmare in the future and then blaming other people for it. But that's not the right kind of leadership. Martin Luther King didn't go around America saying, I have a nightmare. He said, I have a dream. I have a dream of a better world, a world that we all know in our bones is the right world. And a lot of people weren't comfortable with it, but they all knew that it was the right thing. Maybe that's why they reacted so violently to it. Now, this dream of his isn't complete. He died for this dream. But I think it's one of the best examples in human history of asking people to rise up to be a better version of themselves and to collaborate. He invited everyone, black and white and brown, to all work together to build that better world. I think we need leadership like that on climate change, saying, hey, look, a really great world is possible. Let's invite all of us to join together in building that better world, and let's see what we can do. So in conclusion, here's my ask of you. Please keep doing what you're doing, learning, going to webinars, doing things like this. Share what you learn with others. All of us have become little media empires on Facebook and Twitter in the last decade or two. So share what you've learned. I hope we can be a resource to you. Drawdown.org has the Drawdown Review, all of the latest research. We're going to keep it constantly up to date. So go get that, add that to your old copy of the Drawdown book. We're not going to do books anymore. We're going to do it all electronically and all for free. We're also going to be adding a lot of new educational resources, including online classes and webinars, so stay tuned for those. And please, please, please follow us on social media. We don't have a lot of money or ways to reach people. So if you can help by connecting to us, that would be much, much appreciated. And finally, let's remember that the future isn't written yet, especially in climate change. It belongs to us to make a choice, to take a risk, accept some responsibility, and consciously create the future we want. So let's get out there and build that better future, and let's see if we can do it together. So with that, I hope we have a little time for questions. I know we started a little bit late, but I want to be respectful of people's time. So Evan, why don't we let you MC the Q&A part?
Absolutely, and thanks again so much for that awesome presentation. I think it was really insightful, and I'm seeing all the comments here in chat. People are loving this, so thank you, John. So prior to the event starting, we sent out a poll asking people to submit some questions. We sent then another poll asking folks to vote on the questions that our team selected. So just kind of starting right off at the top here, you know, there's been a lot of discussion around the two are sort of intersecting, lessons learned perhaps from the COVID crisis that might be able to apply to how we deal with climate. And in fact, you wrote a piece on this recently. So I'm curious if you might be able to share some of your thoughts on the matter. And John, I think you're on mute, so let me see what's going on here.
Here we go. Okay, good. Yeah, I've been asked a lot of that. I'm going to actually share with you a link to a little piece I wrote about this, share with everybody if you want. I also have a little blog that you can find here too, just called globalecoguy.org. Sorry, I'm trying to copy that in here. I don't think it's working quite right. There we go. So yeah, that's a blog that I write on Medium. So if you want to look for that, that'd be great. Maybe help share some of that. I wrote an article about this exact question, but let me answer it right now. Well, first of all, I want to say right now and right here, like nobody should be celebrating the silver linings of a pandemic. I get really annoyed when people do that. We're talking about, you know, there's hundreds of thousands of people who are going to die from this who didn't need to. Let's not be celebrating anything. This is just a tragedy, and that's as simple as it is. The economic tragedy this is going to cause may be even more devastating to a lot of people as well. So it's kind of this kind of double whammy effect of a pandemic and then a depression. So we are going to have some big impacts. It's going to hurt a lot of people, period. Nobody should be celebrating. In terms of climate change, there are two lessons I would take here. One is the parallels between a pandemic and the destruction of ecosystems is kind of one kind of bundle of things that's kind of interesting. It's very similar to me to like a severe storm or a fire season and climate change. A pandemic like COVID-19 is not unique. It's not isolated. This is about the 50th outbreak of a new infectious disease we've seen in the last 30 years. This is just the one that got the most spread around the world, the one you've heard of the most. But there have been dozens and dozens of these, and about 80% of them have one thing in common. They jumped from animals, and for the very first time in all of evolution, they jumped into the human species where we have no immunity. Why did that happen? Well, frankly, it's too many people invading too many rainforests, tearing down too many healthy ecosystems, breaking them down. Breakdowns mean outbreaks, because when you break down a healthy ecosystem, viruses have to find somewhere to go, and they jump into us because we're the new meat, basically. We also trade in wildlife and wet markets around the world for either traditional medicines or as meat. Very dangerous. Bushmeat in particular is a very, very dangerous proposition. And also animal agriculture in some parts of the world, actually many, including this country's, we have too many animals confined too close together with very poor regulation and oversight and almost no transparency near too many other people. And so some viruses are jumping out of the domesticated animals, not just the wild animals. But 80% of diseases we've seen that are novel to us, from HIV onto coronavirus, were zoonotic. They came from other animals, and they shouldn't have jumped into us, but they did. I think there's a parallel to climate change. Climate change is like the ecological destruction of rainforests and the bad forms of agriculture. It's a slow, steady erosion of the planet. And every so often, we have more and more and more big storms, big floods, big droughts, big fires. So the thing I worry about is we sometimes look at the individual incident without seeing the bigger pattern. We'll react like crazy to COVID, but then not maybe be prepared for the next pandemic, which is like, hey, we should stop deforestation. We should really regulate animal agriculture better. We should highly regulate the wildlife trade and wet markets globally, because it'll save lives. Same thing with climate change. We can't just react to one season of fires in Australia. Of course, you do that in the minute, but long term, we also have to address climate change, which is making that more and more severe and more frequent. So that's kind of my worry about that.
Thank you for sharing.
Well, one other thing to think about. Sorry, I probably don't want to go on too long about this, but after the last big recession globally in 2007, 2008, the US, for example, peaked our emissions. The very highest emissions we've ever had were in 2007. Then they plummeted in 2008. Everybody thought they'd go back up again. They didn't. They kept declining. In fact, through this last year, we've seen a slow, steady lowering of CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases generally from the US, including everything we've offshored. If you even include all that in the accounting, the US economy has been lowering its emissions, and until the last 2 months had dramatically grown our economy and also significantly grown our population. So we finally broke the link between economic growth and emissions growth. And it happened after a recession, because the economies that come back after recessions are fundamentally different than the ones that were there before. And right after recessions, people tend to be much more frugal, much more energy efficient. They tend to buy smaller cars. Companies that still have a lot of cash but can't hire people, don't know what to do for a while, like an Apple or somebody, they're going to invest in infrastructure and automation and efficiency, things like this that'll pay off long term because it's a good investment for them, invest in themselves. So I wonder if that might happen this time too. We may see a deep investment by industry and finance into efficiency, retrofitting, kind of being prepared for the economy to boom back someday, but right now it's not. So anyway.
No, thanks for sharing. I got a couple more questions, and I know we're coming up on time, so I'm going to just jump straight into the next one. In past interviews I've heard with you, you've talked about sort of putting a price on carbon. I'm sure followers of Drawdown will notice that, a carbon price is not a climate solution that Drawdown lists in the research. And though you touched on this earlier today, could you just clarify for folks who are perhaps still wondering why that is? and what your own personal view is on carbon pricing.
Policies aren't solutions. So what we call a solution means it's something that physically changed the air. We use the word solution very deliberately. Like somebody can pass a law, put their name on a piece of paper, and the atmosphere doesn't notice. To us, a solution means the atmosphere actually noticed it. So there's a lowering of emissions, there's a draw of carbon out of the atmosphere, there's whatever. So solutions are physical things that physically manifest in the atmosphere. Laws, policies, culture, those aren't solutions. They're accelerators of solutions. So we like carbon pricing when we put it in the accelerators part, but it's not by itself a solution because it depends a lot on what the price is, who pays it, and what kind of energy are you putting it on, and where does the money go? And the thing is, a single carbon price, I think, is incredibly naive. First of all, no politicians in the world would ever pass it because it would have to be big enough to hurt. If you want to get people to stop buying gasoline, you're going to have to make the price of gasoline like triple what it is now. Show me one politician that would do that. I don't think they are there. And the price you'd have to put on gasoline to nudge behavior is very different than the carbon price it would need for electricity, or for your buildings, or for meat. So the price elasticity of our cultural response, like when we decide to stop buying something, is very different depending on what form of carbon we're talking about, because the prices and incentives are radically different. So you need a different price for every single thing. I'd like to see a carbon tax first on first-class seats in airplanes. That would be interesting. Maybe get people like, you know what, maybe I don't need that because there's a perfectly good alternative back there. Things like this, or a carbon price on our luxury items, things like this. So either use a carbon price to disincentivize people from buying things like a tax on cigarettes. You have to make it really big. You got to like double the price of this stuff. And I don't think politicians have the stomach for it. They haven't so far. The other is keep a low carbon price, which is what industry is getting interested in, a very low price, but then use the money it generates to then invest in more things like renewables and transforming the economy. But do you trust our policymakers to use that money the way it's intended? And do you really want the Trump administration to have, billions and billions of dollars called an energy fund? Do we trust them to implement that? I don't. Jared Kushner would be running it or something. My God, who knows where the money would go. So I'm not the biggest fan of carbon taxes as a silver bullet, but anything we can do to nudge people from fossil stuff to renewables, for example, from bad to good, either tax the hell out of this, put a carbon price on it, sure. But I don't mind a rebate on the cheaper thing. It's the same net effect. So if you want to get Republicans on this, call it a tax break for renewables, or a tax credit or a rebate, things like that. I don't care. It's just kind of making the good stuff more competitive with the old stuff. So whether it's carbon prices, carbon taxes, or call it a tax break or a refund, whatever, the economics is kind of nudging people towards the good, away from the bad. But again, every sector works a little differently. How you do it for beef would be very different than gasoline, would be different than electricity. So it's not a magic wand, but it's certainly a powerful tool. We'll need part of it where we can implement it, but it might be in pieces.
Gotcha. And speaking of policy and voting, we have an election coming up this coming November. I think a lot of us in not only the climate world, but I would say the socially conscious world as well are extremely concerned about what 4 more years of Trump might mean for the climate solutions movement. I'd love to hear your sort of thoughts and concerns on the matter, and if your team or you personally have thought about sort of what contingency plans we as citizens might need to be thinking about if that ends up being the case. And
there we go. Sorry, I was muted for a second again. I did that myself by accident, but then can't undo it. Yeah, well, a lot of people talk about the federal election. But you know what? We've made progress a lot in the last 3 years despite Trump. Trump has not been a friend to climate change at all. A Clinton administration would have been doing far, far more. But guess what? The federal government is not the only game in town. There's a lot going on in the US. Our emissions are continuing to fall despite Donald Trump. Coal is dying despite Donald Trump. So I'm not looking forward to a Trump administration, believe me. But I don't think it's always the end of the world. I think there's kind of a seductive appeal of thinking of we all have a version of Beltway head, thinking of the romance of Washington, D.C., and the media falls for it, the politicians fall for it. But Hal Harvey, if you haven't heard about him before, he gives a lot of interesting talks. He points out climate policy in the U.S. is really designed by about 100 people you've never heard of. How many people know in this call the chair of your local public utilities commission? Nobody, I bet, or very few of you. How many people know the head of your zoning board or of your metropolitan council that designs your subway lines or bus systems, things like that? That's where, like in San Francisco, the biggest problem is housing. It's because too many people can't afford to live here, so people drive far away, and so our transportation emissions are through the roof because nobody can afford to live where they work or where they want to live. And it's an infill policy. There's huge swaths of San Francisco that are only 2 stories tall. Why? Zoning boards, NIMBYs. It isn't Donald Trump that's hurting us, it's us hurting us. So there's a lot of this is still at the local level. But there are a lot of good things happening at the local level too. Like San Francisco has the greenest electrical grid in the country, believe it or not, PG&Es of any large utility. California and New York states have the most aggressive climate laws in the world, actually. And California, if it were its own country, would be the 5th largest on earth, bigger than the UK. That's pretty cool. If you put California and New York together, those 2 states are 25% of the US economy. Then you add the Fortune 100, then you add some of the key banks, the institutions that have started to divest and so on. There's a lot going on. So if there's a scoundrel in the White House, and guess what, over the next 30 years, probably about half the time, there's going to be somebody you don't like in there. Does that mean we all just give up? It's only 4 years. I'm talking about 30. So I don't buy that argument that it's, on November 4th, the planet will die if Trump gets elected. It won't be helped, but I'm not giving up. Are you? In the meantime, yeah, let's vote like crazy. Those of you who live in California, though, like we're pretty much, our vote only mattered in the primary. Our vote in November is completely useless. So focus on your local elections or give money to other states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. If you care about this, let's make sure we're smart about this. And also keep pressure on Biden to actually take more aggressive climate stances. It's very interesting how he has moved more and more aggressively into this space. I think thanks a lot to Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, perhaps, and seeing how they were successful, and he wants to be a part of that too. So I'd say keep going, and there are lots of levers of change in the world, not just in Washington.
Absolutely. Couple more questions, if that's all right, John.
I'm good. So Sunday, I'm just chilling out.
Great, awesome, thank you. And you mentioned a little bit about this earlier, I think politely alluding to it. There's a lot of excitement. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. So it seems as even if we basically stop all emissions tomorrow, we're still going to be well above the 300 ppm target for carbon in the atmosphere. And meanwhile, carbon capture technology has gotten a tremendous amount of attention. And I think a lot of people are thinking about this almost like as perhaps the or a sort of silver bullet kind of technology that could like save us all. Mm. And, I think it's important with you being here today, just to get your perspective on the matter. Do you look at carbon removal technologies as something that could be a necessary measure or a nice to have measure if we can scale it, or really just an unnecessary distraction?
Well, I'll answer as a scientist first. We don't have direct air capture, if that's what you mean by machines that sequester carbon. The only carbon removal engineering we included in our scenarios was a little bit of biochar. And we used about as much of it as we think could possibly happen. Of course, the biochar enthusiasts think, you could do more. I'm like, well, so far you're on this curve. We increased it a lot. You want to go up to here. Let's see. That's why we're going to keep revising our numbers every year. because the world changes and we learn more. So go biochar, people, please go demonstrate this. The more you do, the more we can look at the numbers and see them get bigger. But we haven't included any direct air capture or what's called BECCS, bioenergy and carbon capture. We don't have any of that because we actually implemented a lot of kind of agroforestry solutions, a lot of regenerative agriculture solutions, though much more modest claims to those numbers than some people would say. That's the difference between YouTube science versus actual science. There's a lot of people you can watch a YouTube video of who will claim, oh, farming will sequester all the carbon out of the atmosphere. All the scientists who've actually analyzed the data globally shake their head and say these numbers are about 5 times bigger than what the science shows. So we do have a lot of that. We think nature is a better solution than machines right now, certainly today. So let's start deploying that. So again, that's the now is better than new. I know that trees work. I know that regenerative agriculture works, at least to some degree. I know that reducing methane emissions works, and so on and so on. So in protecting wetlands, protecting forest, do all that now because we've known how to do that for centuries. That doesn't waste time. And then maybe in 10 years, 20 years, somebody invents a gizmo that you turn it on and it sucks carbon out of the air and makes jet fuel for you or something, or makes building blocks or cements that absorb CO2 instead of emit it. Awesome, great. Let's do it, throw it in there. But I think waiting for tech more than time. I'm sorry, I got it wrong. Time more than tech is what we need. We need time because we've literally squandered 30 years. There's no scenario where we can wait 10 years for some venture capitalist project to get done and then we have the silver bullet. We have to start now. But I believe in all solutions in tandem. You'll notice we have about 100 solutions to this job because we couldn't possibly do it with just one or even just 10 or just 50. We need lots of solutions. And yeah, I would welcome the additional kind of engineering solutions, but I'm not waiting for them and I'm not betting the planet on them. No way. It's a lot simpler to stop a coal power plant right now than build some gizmo that removes the, it's also just entropy. Like, you have a cup of coffee and you pour cream into it. It's a lot harder to remove the cream from the coffee after you stirred it in than it is to simply not put it in there in the first place. Same thing with the atmosphere. It's a lot better to not have put the carbon in the air than it is to build a machine that somehow removes it again. By the way, those machines currently being powered by fossil fuels. Like what? It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So let's prevent pollution first with efficiency, cost-effective things we can do right here, right now. Let's reduce the methane leaks. Let's stop burning down the trees. If you want to have carbon sinks, let's work with forest. Let's work with farms. Let's work with wetlands. Absolutely. And if some other gizmos come along down the road, and I hope they do, I'm not against them at all. I just would say right now, don't wait and don't bet on those solutions.
And another solution that I think is a thorny topic, I've noticed in conversations with folks, nuclear energy. I'm curious if you could sort of give your own perspective as a scientist on the role that nuclear has to play as we confront a challenge like the climate crisis.
Yeah, well, nuclear right now is still the world's largest source of non-carbon emitting energy in the US and most countries. It is still vastly larger than solar and hydro and so on, but it's already in the Western countries anyway, no one has built a new nuclear power plant in decades. The United States, I'd be willing to bet people serious money out of my own pocket that we will not build another nuclear power plant in this country ever again in our lifetime, at least the current kind of technologies. We've wasted billions and billions of dollars and decades of cost overruns on plants in Georgia and other places. Inevitably, they all get shut down and the money just get, we get government bailouts and nothing ever seems to get built. Instead, if that money had been put into solar plants or wind, we would have done 10 times more electricity generation for the same amount of money. Nuclear is just too bloody expensive. Then there, of course, in this country, and don't blame the environmentalist. It's not because of regulations. It's because of ineptitude of the companies that are doing this, and the fact that we just lost the ability to do it. France had it going for a long time, but I doubt they could build a new reactor today either, nor could the UK or Scandinavia. So I think it's only going to be China and India that go seriously into more nuclear, and maybe the Russians. And Russia wants to kind of build, reactors that can be portable, like on boats. If there's anything that like makes me more nervous, it's a Russian-made nuclear reactor floating around in the ocean. This does not make me sleep well. So I'm not a huge fan. But I don't erase nuclear for ideological reasons. To just say the math doesn't work, the economics don't work right now. If though they come along with these next generation reactors, the smaller, more modular reactors Bill Gates likes to talk about, the thorium reactors, sure, maybe for some limited applications, especially when you need a lot of heat and a lot of electricity, like making steel or some advanced manufacturing, that might have a real role. So we're not anti-nuclear at all. The nuclear industry gets pissed at us, but it's mainly because we just point out the obvious, like you haven't built a damn thing in 30 years. And every project you have has a 10 times cost overrun, plus a decades of delays. And while you're still trying to put your shoes on, solar and wind are circling the track around you and you're eating their dust. So the nice thing about solar and wind is we can build them in an economy of scale now. They're on big mass, assembly lines in China, basically building, and every solar panel you build, the next one gets cheaper because you're building exactly the same one again and again and again and again. You don't do that with nuclear power plants. Every single one is a unique little entity all by itself. And I don't know why, but in this country, we can't seem to build anything on time and on budget, whether it's the Big Dig in Boston, whether it's the new Bay Bridge or whatever. It's again, these giant public monstrosity projects get out of control. Solar and wind, though, are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, faster and faster. They're kind of like computers that way, unlike big engineering projects. So we're not anti-nuclear drawdown. We're just kind of like, the math doesn't look that great. It's still on our solutions list. We have a number for it. But I think it'll be in China, maybe India, maybe South Korea, maybe Russia, maybe the only places that really build these things for now. But, prove me wrong. 10 years from now, we'll see.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions you think people have about solving climate change?
Well, the biggest one is that it's impossible. Nope, not at all. 2, that we can't do it with tools we have today. We need new fancy technologies. Nope, that's not true either. Third would be that it's only fossil fuels and CO2 that's causing the problem. D minus, 62% credit. You missed 38% of the problem. That's passing the not great grade. There's a whole lot of other things we can do too. Or that food and the agricultural land use systems are the second and almost tied with first biggest contributor to climate change. That there are multiple gases, it's CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide, which I don't hear people talking about much, and fluorinated gases. So you got to look at the whole board, look at all the levers, and I think people need at least a fundamental basics of climate change before they go out there and try to solve it. I think the other biggest misconception is it's all like federal, like we have to wait for Washington and the UN to save us. I'm sorry, if I were in the Titanic and I was looking for who's going to get us off this damn boat and solve the problem, I probably wouldn't go with the UN and the US House of Representatives, if you know what I mean. I'd like to find more competent leadership who actually know what they're doing. And right now, look at the COVID response. Here's another thing we might be able to learn from the coronavirus. Who's actually leading? It's been mayors and governors and companies and some NGOs. Washington has been, like, if anything, counterproductive, let alone productive. And the international bodies have been caught kind of off base too. The WHO does good work, but they aren't saving our lives right now either. So I think there's some leadership lessons here, that the leadership to solve climate change is far more distributed than we think, and elections have not as much to do with it as we probably believe. Though I think they're important, but it's a much more nuanced problem than this.
And given all the challenges that lie ahead as we seek to solve the climate crisis, are there any specific challenges that concern you the most? What is really keeping you up at night?
Well, the things that keep me up at night are the infrastructure switches, that middle wave I talked about. Like, there's a lot we can do in the near run that make us money, And markets are good at solving problems. Markets do seek things that like cost less and make money. So that's the one good thing about capitalism, if it's guided in a better way. So I hope we see a lot more, especially after a recession, people doing a lot more efficiency, less big polluting cars, things like this. And renewables being so cheap. Like, why would I buy coal today? That's idiotic. I'm going to buy solar now. So what's exciting to me is that is happening. What is terrifying to me, though, is the long delay that it's going to take to switch out every furnace in the world, every internal combustion engine. Right now, for every electric vehicle sold in America, we sell 15 SUVs, 14 of whom probably were never needed. They're just a status symbol for a lot of folks. These cars are going to last on the road for over 17 years is the time a car is purchased, and by the time it goes to a landfill on average in this country. So wow, we've got a whole bunch of crappy cars we got to get off the road faster. Maybe we need another cash for clunkers kind of program to get people to buy more efficient vehicles, hybrids, better yet electric, or no vehicle at all. So this would all be really, really helpful. But I worry about that, this kind of naivete that we can solve all this right away. It might take 30 years. Let's put it this way. If you want to go into plumbing, and if you're an electrician or a plumber, you are golden for this. You're going to have a lot of work to do in the next 30 years once we start retrofitting, ripping out every furnace and replacing them with high efficiency heat pumps, ripping out every hot water heater, replacing it with a heat pump, getting rid of every internal combustion engine, updating everybody's electrical panel in every apartment and every building in the world so you can have a plug-in car if you want it, or feed in solar if you want to. Oh my God, so that's what's going to take a while. It doesn't keep me up at night, but it daunts me as how big that challenge is, but what a great opportunity. What would tip it off though, would be some big snowballs to help get it going. Jeff Bezos said he's going to commit $10 billion to climate solutions. I'm like, hey, Jeff, I got an idea for you. Spend it all right now in the next 6 months on heat pumps. Buy heat pumps for everybody in America, starting with the most vulnerable, poorest people in the country. Give them away. Have Amazon come to low-income communities and say, I'm going to give you a brand new heat pump that's going to lower your utility bills and it'll last for 30 years and has no moving parts really. Here it is, boom. It would lower the price of heat pumps for everybody else forever after. So now that becomes the de facto technology. Once we build enough of these things, and if you have the volume of a Jeff Bezos or an Amazon distributing these things, they're going to plummet in price. And now that becomes the de facto technology. Nobody will buy another furnace again. That's cool. So I think we need some tipping points in the economics to get electric cars to be cheaper than their alternatives. Right now, they're a little more expensive at first, but then cheaper in the long run. Same thing with heat pumps, same thing with others. Let's drive down the cost of those things so they become ubiquitous. Or better plant-based diets or meat alternatives. We need those too. Let's make those better, cheaper, more acceptable. There's a lot of things we can do there.
Yeah, and speaking of opportunities, you were talking about work opportunities, and speaking of income, you're mentioning low-income communities that would benefit from being delivered heat pumps by Amazon. A lot of folks that we work with through Climate.Careers are specifically looking to not just change their consumer behaviors so that they are spending their money in ways that are more climate impactful, but so that they are actually changing their careers so that they are making their money in a way that is climate impactful. Yep. There's quite a few people joining us today that are currently in school thinking about, what do they want to do with their careers? What would your advice be for folks who are looking at climate change and solving the climate crisis as their career calling?
Well, gosh, I don't feel qualified to guide, everyone without meeting them first, kind of on a career advice. But I guess, generally good advice is like, think about your passions and like what feeds your soul and your heart is really important. Avoiding burnout. We all feel burnout at times. We all feel frustrated at times. We all feel anxious at times. You're going to have some of that no matter what, but kind of what keeps you going is really, really important. So please pay attention to that. Second is if you have intrinsic skills, like people asking me a lot, like, well, what can I do to help with climate change? I'm like, I look at them like, I don't know. What can you do? Like, are you a good engineer? Great, we need some of you. Are you a great plumber? Are you excellent at retrofitting, furnaces to heat pumps? Great, we really need you. Are you a farmer? Are you an engineer? Are you an electrician? There's a lot of really good kind of high tech and blue collar jobs that are needed here for sure. These are the heroes. I mean, of the climate movement aren't going to be politicians and activists. It's going to be plumbers and electricians and engineers, I think. But we also need small businesses to kind of, make this kind of a new way of doing small business. Half of American jobs are in small business. So how do we do that? What are the opportunities for business and for communities? I also think people on the front lines of community organizing on healthcare, public health and climate change are very tightly connected. Also, people work on justice issues, the disproportionate impacts of environmental pollution, especially air quality and lead water lines and stuff like this. It definitely affects more people of color and poorer people than other folks. And we're seeing that even with COVID, that more and more of the cases of COVID are from people who've had chronic exposure to pollution more often than not in low income and minority communities. That's unconscionable. So those are areas we need help with. So I don't think there's just one answer here. As a kid, I wanted to be an astronomer and a physicist. I'm good at math and science stuff. I'm not very good at much else. So when it came time to kind of find my calling, I gave up astronomy and decided I was going to work on this planet and did my, kind of advanced graduate work and PhD on this stuff. And I've been in academia and science communication and now running an NGO ever since. But that's just one path. That's not right for everybody. And I wouldn't make a very good plumber, and some people wouldn't make a great scientist. So go find what you're good at, what you love. And no one is going to be the hero of this story. It's going to be really us, not anybody individually.
Yeah. And speaking of heroes, I'm curious. I mean, so many people know about Drawdown at this point. Millions of people around the world have received the message that was originally shared in the 2017 bestseller Drawdown. I'm curious though, when you think about who you look up to, other scientists and climate communicators, for the fans of Drawdown, who else should they be looking to and listening to?
Oh, wow. This feels like an Academy Award speech. I know, forget someone. This is not a complete list. One of the things we're going to do at a Drawdown website down the road, by the way, is start adding kind of like learn more kind of sections to each of our solutions. So we kind of point you to other neutral, nonprofit or academic organizations who aren't trying to sell you stuff. So I think before you listen to anybody, kind of ask a little bit about like, is this person credible? Do they have, expertise actually matters? Sorry, but people who spent 30 years, I mean, who do you trust when it comes to public health? Somebody like Anthony Fauci has worked on this for 40 years, or some blowhard politician who's looking for ratings or money. So ask a little bit about motive, ask a little bit about expertise. Do they really know what they're talking about? Also, let's look a lot more at diverse voices. There's still, like in every field, unfortunately, but in climate, this is still very true. I mean, look at the two of us. We get two, white male dudes on the screen right now. One older, but still, it's kind of like we get to have more diverse voices and make sure we hear a diversity of voices, not only of color and gender, but also of attitude and background. So, and listen to people that you don't like sometimes. I don't mean like Rush Limbaugh or somebody, but I mean people you don't quite agree with, but you can see their point of view. Like I sometimes don't agree with some of the more extreme climate activist communities, but I definitely listen to them and become to respect them and realize we'll have some differences of opinion, but we're all rowing in the same direction. Things like this. So I think it's important to do that. Some of my favorites, though, if you want to get to that, I love following Katharine Hayhoe. A lot of you know her, a climate scientist, brilliant communicator. She personally is also an evangelical Christian, which gives her kind of a unique lens to look at how society reacts to these messages. And she's just an incredible, honest, and lovely person. I would look, gosh, I don't know. It's almost Earth Day's anniversary. I would follow Tia Nelson. She's the daughter of Gaylord Nelson, who was the founder of Earth Day back in 1970. Tia's carrying on the banner of kind of the Earth Day movement and her father, which is pretty interesting. And you'll see a lot of hubbub about that in the coming days. So maybe follow her. Really excited about some of the up and coming women climate leaders. There's so many that you'll see. Catherine Hayhoe has a good list of them as well. There's some also brilliant young writers who are coming up through the ranks. I think there's a new batch of people to be listening to that are pretty exciting in this space. Yeah, I don't know. And I would avoid people who give you ulcers and make you angry all the time. I think that's not really helpful, but that's just me.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on an hour and a half now.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to be adjourning this pretty soon, but I want to ask one final question.
Sure.
You know, with everything that's going on in the world, I think a lot of people can feel overwhelmed by thinking about, you know, the upcoming election and of course the pandemic that's happening right now. And then of course, on top of that, we also have to deal with climate change and avoiding a climate disaster. What gives you hope? You know, even in like the darkest of hours for you, what keeps you feeling optimistic that we can achieve building a future that we want?
Well, that's a really, really hard question, and each of us has to answer it by itself. Let me answer in two parts. One, first and foremost, I would recommend people actually follow some of the mental health professionals who are getting into this space now. One woman named Renee Lertzman, who's a psychiatrist. She lives in the Bay Area, by the way. She is brilliant and just gave a really powerful TED Talk. So if you go to TED.com and look, there's one, yeah, again, her name is Dr. Renee Lertzman. She focuses on kind of the grief and anxiety and guilt that we feel around environmental issues, kind of eco-anxiety, climate guilt, that kind of thing. And I don't want to paraphrase her message because I'll probably botch it up, but what I took out of that was you don't go around grief and anxiety. You have to kind of go through it and process it. And there are stages of, you know, kind of grieving. It's a little bit like, you know, how this is. So I'll let her use her words because she's better at it than I will ever be. But I encourage you to kind of read about that and acknowledge that sometimes you're going to feel sad and depressed and frustrated and despondent about things. It is okay to feel that way. Talk about it. I think a lot of times people didn't. I didn't until maybe a year or two ago because, you know, well, guys are not supposed to talk about that kind of thing. You just power through is kind of how I was brought up. That's pretty silly. So I think talking about it helps a lot. The other thing is gives me hope is like, really, compared to the world we used to have, think of a time in human history where we've never been better off. Yeah, we got huge challenges, but like, you know, a few hundred years ago, people like you and me would have been burned at the stake, literally, for believing in germs exist or that the sky could warm. We would have been executed for saying such things in most of human history. That's not true anymore. You might get a lot of crap on Twitter, but you're not being burned at the stake just yet. So that's kind of an improvement. We also have the tools to solve the problem. We have so much capability, so much goodwill, so much heart out there. If we could only bring it together and focus it. I'm just extraordinarily amazed by the abundance of the human spirit, of our capabilities, of the amazing people we continue to meet. And if we could just focus a fraction of that on solving this problem, that problem doesn't stand a chance. I'm also reminded of being hopeful by my own, you know, short life on Earth here has been like, wow, everything I was told as a kid that was impossible turned out not to only be possible, they were inevitable. Like the Cold War would never end without global nuclear Armageddon. Well, that didn't happen. Or apartheid could never end without a bloodbath and a civil war. Well, hey, that didn't happen. Or gay marriage, oh my God, that'll never happen. Oh wait, it just could happen and nobody really kind of like whatever, you know, it's fun. Or legalized pot or an African-American president. Like these would all be impossible to anybody talking in the 1970s or 80s. And yet they all happened and we're all kind of like, meh, whatever. So you tell me, oh, climate change is not solvable. It's impossible. I'm like, oh yeah, bring it on. We can solve this thing. And the other thing I would remind people is hope is a verb. It is not a noun. You hope is a verb. That means you get up in the morning, you may risk the chance of failure and you know it, but you get up anyway and you give everything you have, your heart, your head, your hands, everything, risking it all for the chance maybe to do something good in the world. That's different than optimism. I'm not especially an optimist, like, oh, it'll all turn out okay, but I'm hopeful because that's a verb. It requires courage and heart and staring the risk of failure right in the eye and saying, I'm going to do it anyway. So that's where I come from.
Well, John, I think that's a great ending point. For folks that want to stay in touch with Drawdown, I mean, what's the best way for people to stay engaged with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, I don't want to pitch, but I would definitely ask people to please come to our website. We are making a lot of resources starting now. Will be a lot more in the coming year, depending on our funding and COVID and all this stuff. We're, everybody's a little whacked out right now, but we'll get there. This book, if you have it, great, keep it. But in the future, I would download the new thing, which is free. And it's it's a smaller book. It's about 100 pages, but it's free and you can read it on whatever and share it like crazy. So please come to our website. Sign up for our mailing list too. We promise not to spam you very often or, ask you for money or anything like that very often. We just kind of send a few things out a year. But it's a great mailing list. There's also very active following on Facebook. There's a Project Drawdown group on Facebook, about 30 to 40,000 people on it. And we have pretty active Twitter following, and it's just, at Project Drawdown is Twitter and Facebook. Our Instagram game isn't quite up there yet, but we'll be getting there more if you're on Instagram. But certainly Facebook, Twitter, and our mailing list, and the key website. So we're pretty easy to find, and love to hear from you. And a lot more coming soon, especially on kind of educational resources and community resources, things like that. And every year from now on, we hope to have a bigger kind of update to all this research and make it fresh and respected and timely. We can only do that through electronic publication.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again so much for joining today, Dr. Foley. Folks that are still with us, it looks like there's about 200 people still here. I just want to say thank you so much. You've been with us for coming up on an hour and 45 minutes. So yeah, I know, time flies. And we'll be doing more events, hopefully more events in the future with Project Drawdown and other members of their team as well. In the meantime, you can check out Climate.Careers for various climate impactful jobs. I'm sure many of you are now thinking about your next job opportunity, or perhaps you're on the job hunt. Consider that as a resource. We also have a full list of online Earth Day and climate-related events happening from around the world, which you can stream from the safety of your shelter-in-place home. So consider that as a resource. And until next time, stay safe, everyone. And thanks again, John, for joining today.
You bet, Evan. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much for the opportunity. And thanks to everybody for spending time on a Sunday for, or any day of the week with this stuff. So that's pretty amazing. I also typed into the chat box my own personal kind of blog on Medium, which is a little separate from Drawdown. It's a little bit bigger scope, but often related. So if you'd like to follow there, that'd be great too. And love to see you over there. It's just globalecoguy.org. That's kind of how you find me on my handle everywhere. Is this stupid Global Eco Guy, for the only reason that nobody had taken it yet. I couldn't find my own name, was gone. So if you want to follow me on Twitter and Facebook and all the rest, as well as Drawdown, just look for Global Eco Guy. And my blog's at globalecoguy.org. Stupid name, but it's easy to remember. So, and it is available. So hopefully see you all soon.
All right. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.